Hi, my name is Reid. I'm a psychotherapist in San Francisco, California. And today I'd like to talk about how the scapegoated survivor of narcissistic abuse may cope by thinking ahead in time. So, the sentence to being the scapegoat in the narcissistic family is a real damning one. As this image captures, um, the role of the scapegoat is to sort of be blamed by all sources in the narcissistic family where there is no escape. In this photo, it seems like, in essence, three separate index fingers pointing at, the scapegoated sort of victim who's covering his face in going to presume sort of a state of shame, which may reflect the burden that the scapegoat must bear, that, of being, in essence, told that the problem is who you are, not what you've done, and nothing that can be corrected. It's who you are, and we are unrelenting in our accusation that you and who you are is the problem. I mean, I think of that as sort of being represented by the fingers being pointed. There's no questioning by the part of the finger pointers, and they're not even in this photo, that this man here is to blame. And I think it just so well depicts the fact that there is really no exit for the scapegoated victim of narcissistic abuse. So with that sort of understanding of the problem faced by this child selected as the scapegoat by the narcissistic parent, what might the child do to just find a way to survive such, in a way, while it's going on, hopeless mistreatment? And one strategy that I think can be vital of maintaining a sense of hope in the midst of this sort of inescapable abuse is looking ahead to a point in time in the future. To just kind of look ahead and just be oriented to kind of what comes next. What is a goal I want to get to? Can really help with just kind of dampening the awareness of how bad things are when one is in the scapegoated role. The looking ahead may not in one's bones feel like, oh, the future will be better, but one can, at least if one looks ahead to the future, create reasons why it might be better. And it's the faith in those reasons that can be integral to surviving this form of unrelenting abuse, derision, contempt, and hostility. In tandem with looking ahead, there's a simultaneous diminution of awareness of what's going on right now. And that is very adaptive when what's going on right now feels terrible and, again, is unrelenting, where there's no end in sight. That is, again, a characteristic of being the scapegoat in the narcissistically abusive family. It feels terrible and there's no end in sight. People aren't going to have a change of heart about who the scapegoat is, because that scapegoat performs too important a function for the entire narcissistic family, namely to keep the narcissistic parent feeling better than the scapegoat and not threatened by that scapegoat's attributes, and providing the narcissistic parent with someone whom they can offload their own sense of worthlessness onto, and thereby sort of feel more intact internally. But it's a very fragile arrangement for that person. Let's going back to kind of the scapegoated child's experience here. If they were to sort of focus on what was going on in their present and what things feel like, then a couple of things could happen. They may feel the feelings of the hopelessness, the dread, boredom, and the boredom due to the lack of stimulating and safe relationships available to them, and in a way just want to sort of collapse under the weight of it all. They may also notice how little control they have over how others are treating the child, and having no way to effectively fight or flee these people, right? Because as we talked about in other videos, the child needs the family at all costs. And the option of fleeing the family in a real way is never a viable option. Similarly with fighting, you don't fight to win in your family in a decisive manner. It's an imperative for the child that you keep on going with these people. So given how dreadful noticing and focusing on the present moment can feel like when in the throes of such abuse, finding a way to focus on what's next, and over time that becoming habitual, can keep one's attention away from these kinds of awful pockets of one's experience that emerge when focused on the present. And a couple examples come to mind. So in one case, a scapegoated survivor of a narcissistic family remembered telling his parent in first grade that it seemed to this child like time moved incredibly slow when the child would look at the clock in a classroom. And in therapy, we unpacked how the client had to work very hard to keep their mind on what was coming next. But when they were unable to sort of fly into the fantasy of what might be next, like what's going to happen when they get home from school, what might they be having for dinner, and when none of those were sort of available for them to think about, then the plodding, despairing, and sort of utterly slow march of time became thrust into his awareness, and he needed to figure out some way to diminish that experience and not make it so overwhelming to him at the time. And we came to understand how looking to find out what's coming next or thinking what's ahead was a very important strategy for doing that. Another example was a scapegoated survivor recalled kind of almost compulsively making schedules for himself starting in elementary school, where, sort of like think about what would be the activities he was going to do after school. And they don't typically be activities he had full control over, like tasks he wanted to get done or studies he wanted to complete. And there was a real satisfaction he took in accounting for almost every minute and hour that was going to be there after school. And it helped him, as we would kind of, again, unpack it in therapy, to reinforce his strategy that he could escape the dreadful feelings and helplessness of not being able to change the present feelings he was experiencing. But if he could kind of make out this schedule and with the pretense of following it, it afforded a sense of, I can get through this. There's something ahead of me that might be better than what is now. And of course, this survivor would face nearly nightly bouts of being attacked by his narcissistic parent. And of course, that wouldn't be put in the schedule. So it was sort of this way of structuring his experience that allowed him to kind of keep his attention away from the threat, which was fairly inevitable, and offer himself a much needed sense of hope. How might this strategy manifest in adulthood after kind of surviving a childhood as a scapegoat of a narcissistic family? I think everyone looks ahead here and there to what's coming. What I'm talking about today is more about how the looking ahead occurs. If you find yourself looking ahead nearly all the time with a felt sort of promise internally that then things will be or feel better than now, maybe for some identified reason, like once work is over, the workday is over, once this workout is finished, once this interaction is over, that when it becomes sort of habitual in this regard, then it very well may stem from having to evacuate the present moment to escape abuse from the people whom one was in essence captivity with in the narcissistic family. So I hope so far that I've laid out the situation that the scapegoated survivor of narcissistic abuse faces, and why looking ahead to another future moment in time can be an adaptive way to cope with that situation. And now I'd like to offer a few strategies in recovery for getting back to the present moment and gradually and over time relinquishing the coping strategy of looking ahead. So this coping strategy exists almost solely in the mind, in that it's a very thinking-centric and thought-based strategy. So I would offer that the key then is to get in touch with one's body and one's bodily experience on a regular basis, and to find ways to live in it and sort of feel into it so it becomes a resource. And in doing so, this can very much interrupt the very thought-based nature of this coping strategy. And as the body becomes to feel like an ally in your sort of experience in your life, then it can really combat that sense of helplessness, of being unable to change what's happening in the present moment. There's plenty of ways, first of all, to connect to the body, but I just want to focus on 3 today. The first is something that a trauma researcher and teacher named James Gordon writes about in his book, The Transformation, Discovering Wholeness and Healing After Trauma. And what he calls this is a form of expressive meditation, which amounts to shaking and dancing. That in doing this, one might just sort of be in a room where they sort of have some privacy and just begin shaking their body for maybe 10 to 15 minutes. And as that shaking occurs, the idea is that it's not a goal-directed movement. One can feel free to just be as attending to and spontaneous in your bodily movements as is possible. And that's an important component to this, the lack of goal-directedness, because it interrupts that, like, what do I do next, piece to this coping strategy. It's very much, what's my body doing, and trying to sort of follow one's body and the body's own initiative. So that can start with shaking and move to, when it's called dancing, it really is a sort of just spontaneous movement. Another way to connect with the body that's a little more gentle in its movements that I've talked about before is Qi-Jong, which is a sort of like gentle series of movements with one's hands and arms and overall body and breath that just kind of creates an energetic flow within the body. I put it before, but I'll put a link to a 20-minute Qi-Jong sort of moving meditation that can be very helpful in just kind of practicing a gentle connection with one's body. And the third option is something called Osho Dynamic Meditation. And it involves 5 stages, actually. The first stage is something called chaotic breathing, where one tries to breathe in and out in a deep and fast way through one's diaphragm, starting from one's diaphragm, and sort of forcefully exhale being the thrust of it. And you do that for 10 minutes, followed by 10 minutes of just spontaneously moving however one feels compelled to move. And a third 10 minutes of actually jumping up and down while chanting the word who, H-O-O, followed by 15 minutes of just sort of standing as still as possible. And then the last 15 minutes are to just move in a sort of joyous manner for the remainder. I'll put another link to sort of more fuller description of this in the description below. But all 3 of these methods, I think, are important in different ways of getting sort of into one's body, connected to it, so that the experience of being here and now, one feels very resourced in being here, and one gets to feel the fullness of all that one has when they're not just in the mind, but also, in the body. And I think that in an experiential way really helps combat the sense of, I need to escape right now because it's not going to feel good. Again, all of this is incremental and, again, over time and progressive outcome. But, these strategies can be very beneficial, I think, in an incremental fashion right out the gate. It can be very helpful to do 1 or more of these on a daily basis. Well, thank you for tuning in and your continued support and engagement with this channel. I look forward to posting again next week, Sunday at 9 a.m. Pacific time. Take care.